Our next speaker is Clanton, grad student at Ohio State, and he's going to tell us about constraining the demographics of exoplanets using multiple detection methods.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, Ben. So I'll just begin by showing a familiar plot of planet mass versus semimajor axis. And on this plot, I've included the confirmed exoplanet detections around dwarfs, which amounts to some 150 planets. And here I've color-coded them by their detection method for the four main detection methods of radial velocities, or RV, transits, microlensing, and direct imaging. Also in this plot, I have indicated rough schematic representations of the sensitivity regions for each of these techniques. Radial velocities and transits sort of cover the smaller separations. Direct imaging probes longer period, more massive planets, and microlensing sort of bridges the gap between these two. And in my work, I choose to focus on dwarfs for a few reasons. The first of which is that dwarfs are simply the most common stars in our universe. And secondly, because the constraints that we have for microlensing exist primarily for dwarfs, and this is because the rate of microlensing events is explicitly dependent on the mass function of lenses, which is weighted towards lower mass, and so the majority of the microlenses will actually be dwarfs. And finally, there have been several existing exoplanet syntheses that have been conducted using these individual methods and provide a rich data set. So here I'm showing figures of planet frequency as a function of planet mass on the left and semimajor axis on the right. For reference, I've shaded the region corresponding to giant planets in the left-hand plot. And on the right-hand plot, I've marked the approximate location of the ice line around a 0.5 solar mass star. So these green points show that radial velocity surveys have found that the frequency of giant planets is quite low. And I should note that these points, the vertical error bars, represent the measurement error of the planet frequency, while the horizontal bars represent the approximate ranges of planet mass or semimajor axis over which these measurements are made. On the other hand, microlensing surveys, denoted by the blue points, find a giant planet frequency that is more than an order of magnitude larger than that inferred by radial velocity surveys. Direct imaging surveys targeting M-stars have not yet detected any planetary companions, but nevertheless place upper limits on the giant planet frequency shown here by the red bars. Now, it's not exactly clear how all these measurements fit together, as there are various selection effects and observational biases that sort of play with your interpretation of what's going on. But that's precisely what my research focuses on, is to develop a comprehensive picture of exoplanet demographics by combining these results from these various techniques. Now, last year, my advisor, Scott Gowdy, and I released a two-paper series where we compared the results of microlensing and radial velocity surveys and found that this large inferred difference in giant planet frequency can be explained by a steeply declining mass function that heavily favors smaller mass planets, such that radial velocity surveys are only detecting the high mass tail of the large population of giant planets inferred by microlensing. Today I'll focus on a current study that we're working on to include the results of direct imaging surveys to better constrain the population of long-period giant planets. And so in this study, we're including the results from 5 different surveys using these 3 different techniques. And so for microlensing, we employ the results of the Gould and collaborators 2010 survey, which provided a measurement of an integrated planet frequency over a range in mass ratios and projected separations, and also the results of the Sumi et al. 2010 survey, which provided a measurement of the slope of the mass ratio distribution function over a similar region of parameter space probed by the Gould survey. For radial velocity surveys, and since we're interested in long-period planets, we include the results of the CPS trend survey reported by Ben Monte and others, who found 4 significant long-term radial velocity drifts for which they detect no companions in AO images. For direct imaging surveys, we include results from the PALMS, or the Planets Around Low Mass Stars survey by Brendan Bowler and others, and also we include the results from the 16 M-stars that are imaged as part of the Gemini Deep Planet survey and reported by Lafreniere in 2007. Now again, these 2 imaging surveys did not actually detect any planetary companions, but provide upper limits on the planet frequency, which we can use to help constrain the properties of these planets. And so the primary objective of this study is to ask and to answer the question, is there a single planet population which is consistent with the results of all of these surveys? And so to actually approach this problem, we start out by assuming a very simple planet model that's described by a power law, and is only a 4-parameter model, alpha, beta, A, and A out, where these are defined implicitly by this distribution function shown here, where alpha is the slope of the mass function, beta is the slope of the semimajor axis distribution function, A is their normalization, and A out is the outer cutoff radius of the semimajor axis distribution function. And so we start by choosing random values for these parameters and generating a population of planets from this distribution function that is described by various planet masses and semimajor axes. What we then do is we take these masses and semimajor axes and map them into distributions of observables that are relevant to each of these different detection techniques. So for microlensing, this is the planet-to-star mass ratio Q, the projected separation in units of the Einstein radius, S. And in order to obtain these parameters, we need to generate orbital parameters to project the orbit. But we also need to generate lens distances and host star masses, or lens masses in the case of microlensing events. And we need to employ a galactic model as well as a lens mass function in order to wait for the fact that, as Matthew mentioned in the previous talk, that you can't always measure the masses and lenses, the masses and distances of the lens stars and microlensing events. For radial velocities, we need to determine the acceleration of the host star due to any planets that may be orbiting them, as well as the period of these planets. In order to do this, we simply need the masses of the host stars and their orbital parameters. For direct imaging, things are a little bit more complicated, where we need orbital parameters, again, to project the orbit, to derive the projected separation of the planet and the host star. And we also need to employ planet evolutionary models, and we use both cold and hot star models, along with the age and distance estimates of the stars in the direct imaging surveys to derive the contrast between the host star and the planet, which we can then use to determine its detectability. Once we have these observables for each of the planets in a given population, we can then determine the number of expected detections for this particular population, given the actual reported detection limits of each of these surveys. And here I've just shown a few examples from each of the techniques to sort of demonstrate what types of detectability these surveys have. And once we have these number of expected detections, we can compare them with the actual reported results and determine a likelihood for this particular planet population. Finally, we repeat this same analysis for many different populations in order to build up constraints on these 4 parameters that describe our planet model that is given by the relative likelihood of each of these populations according to the results of all of these surveys. And so when we do this, we find that we're able to very tightly constrain the values of alpha, the slope of the mass function, and A, the normalization of the distribution function, quite well. And that's shown here in panel B. However, we find that the distribution of beta, the slope of the semimajor axis function, and the outer cutoff radius are relatively unconstrained. And furthermore, we find that there's a degeneracy between these 2 parameters, shown here in panel E, where large values of beta require closer in cutoff radii for the planet distribution, while the outer cutoff radius is allowed to go out farther into the disk for shallower slopes in semimajor axis. These are just one-dimensional plots of the likelihood functions on each parameter marginalized over the other 3. And again, here we see that the distributions of alpha and the normalization of the distribution function are relatively well constrained, while there is a large range of values of beta and the outer cutoff radius that are allowed. Now notice this feature here below about 10 to 15 AU in the outer cutoff radius, and this is caused by the fact that since direct imaging surveys detect no planetary companions, and they're not actually sensitive to companions that are within some 10 to 15 AU. These are perfectly consistent with those results, and so you can have almost any value of beta be consistent with direct imaging results as long as the outer cutoff radius is within this 10 to 15 AU. However, you'll also notice that there are allowed values of the outer cutoff radius that go out further into the disk, but require smaller values of the slope of the semimajor axis distribution function. And so finally, what this all means is that the results of these different surveys are consistent with a single exoplanet population described by this power law model. And here are just the median values and the 68% confidence intervals that we derive on these parameters. Now, another question that we're currently asking but are still working on and thus don't have a final answer yet is to ask, is this population that we find to be consistent with the results of all these other surveys? Also, can this also explain population of apparently free-floating planets inferred by microlensing surveys as actually being due to wide separation bound planets. And so stay tuned for more on that. Should have a paper coming out pretty soon. And finally, in the future, we intend to include results from the Kepler mission to better constrain the population of short-period low-mass planets. And furthermore, we hope to apply the demographic constraints that we derive from the synthesis of the results from all of these techniques to constrain the output of planet population synthesis models and to improve our understanding of planet formation and migration. Thank you all for your attention, and I'll take questions.
So you are looking at these samples of stars from the RVs and direct imaging, which are all nearby stars, and then the microlensing ones, which are in the bulge, maybe higher metallicity.
That's right.
How hosed are you if the population of stars and then the planets is very different?
So one of the assumptions in our analysis is that each of these surveys are probing sort of a similar sample of host stars. This is sort of the same assumption that was embedded in our comparison between microlensing and radial velocities, where we didn't include any effects like metallicity or anything like that. And in fact, it turned out that we didn't need to, and that the results were actually consistent with one another. But yes, that is sort of an implicit assumption.
Will the K2 campaign 9 determine yes or no, this is the right assumption? Maybe that's a question for Matthew Penny.
You mean in terms of, as far as measuring distances, actual distances and masses for these things?
In terms of measuring the occurrence rate of planets through microlensing in these wider, in comparing to whatever.
To more local samples of RV. So as Matthew mentioned, I think the sample from K2 itself will be quite small, but if you can combine that with these other studies from Spitzer, perhaps, yeah.
I'm sort of curious, since it looks like in your first comparison, you're working with microlensing RV, you're working with two different things, you're mass measurements. But then with your third, when you bring in direct imaging, are you working, or how are you getting to masses of those planets, and sort of how much of a factor is there to make that jump?
So in our comparison that includes direct imaging, we start with planet masses and semimajor axes. So we have these masses. And so from there, for microlensing, we need to derive what the mass ratio is, which means we need to generate a population of host stars. And so the way that we do this is we assume a lens mass function that is consistent with what we know from microlensing. And then we generate an ensemble of microlensing events with sort of basically just random parameters, so random lens distances and everything else, different kinematics. And then we account for our naive assumptions in drawing these distances by weighting each microlensing event by its appropriate event rate. And so this sort of takes into account, all of the unknowns in these stellar parameters. And so for any given individual event, perhaps the masses and things are incorrect. However, for the statistical ensemble of all planets, we marginalize out all those unknown effects.
One more quick question.
Yeah, so I always thought that the radial velocity surveys were on early M dwarfs, whereas the microlensing were more on mid M dwarfs, like the bulk of the galaxy. So, I mean, there is a factor 2 in mass for the star to begin with. So, is that really accounted for there? I mean,
so it's hard to say what exactly the typical mass is for microlensing surveys, but it's something like 0.3 to 0.5. Whereas the California Planet Search, their M-dwarf sample has a median mass of about 0.4 solar masses, and for the HARPS North, for the HARPS North survey, their M-dwarf sample, they have a median mass of 0.3 and change. So it's actually quite similar.
Let's thank Christian again.